Hey, and welcome back to the Clark and Miller English podcast. And if this is your first time here, then just welcome. Welcome. Good to have you here. We have a lot on today. It's quite a long one, but this one is one. I think it's going to be one of my favorites because I have a really in-depth, fascinating chat with Andreas Grundtvig, who's just written a book all about pragmatics. What are pragmatics? Well, you're going to just have to listen to find out. And now I have to let my cat out of the room. Hey, Freya. Yeah, I think she didn't like my ranting. So yeah, what are pragmatics? Well, you'll have to find out, but I can give you a clue because today we're going to talk about a lot of things, including how gamers now and the gay community in the early 20th century and London Cockneys evolved their own form of English and why. Why did they create these creative forms of English? We talk about why they rap the news in Senegal. We talk about how learning about Grice's maxims, what are they? Well, there's a previous podcast episode on those. How learning about Grice's maxims can help you see through modern propaganda. We also talk about how you can understand people from different countries beyond the food of the country and the flag of the country and stuff like that. Really understand how people tick from different places in the world. How to terrorize people by being polite. Yep. And also, with each of the interviews of the Clark and Miller English podcast, everyone gives three tips. And with Andreas, he gives us 3 things you can do right now to improve your pragmatic competence. So, yeah, I won't bore you with any more details. It's a great interview. If it's too long, don't worry, just stop. Listen to 20 minutes and stop and go and do something else and leave it a day and come back to it. That's what I do with long podcast episodes. And I'm just going to say, come to clarkandmiller.com. We have free stuff, free books, free blog posts, the podcast episodes, and some stuff you can buy too if you're feeling like buying something. And also, if you are a Spotify listener, we are almost at 500 followers on Spotify, which I think, according to the internet, is not a huge deal, but quite a big deal. So it would be really good if you're on Spotify, just hit that follow button, because then we'll get to 500 and we get to have a little celebration here at Clark and Miller headquarters. But yeah, without further ado, let's talk to Andreas. I want to apologize very quickly in advance. The audio quality isn't perfect. I blame Zoom, but you get used to it pretty quickly. It's just one of those things. 3 or 4 minutes in, you won't even notice. Okay, I'll leave you to it. I think there won't be an outro for this one, so when you hear the music at the end of the chat with Andreas, that's it, that's the end. Cool, enjoy, and I will talk it to you next time. All right, cool. I'm sitting here virtually with Andreas Grundtvig, who is, I pronounced that right, did I? Grundtvig?
Yeah, sure.
Good. He's just written an awesome book about pragmatics. What is pragmatics? Well, we'll talk about that later. It's called English as Context. It's good. I like it a lot because it's got lots of quotes from Monty Python, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Winnie the Pooh, Johnny Rotten, and a bunch of highbrow people like Nietzsche and Plato and stuff. And before we talk about you, Andreas, I want to talk really quickly about Gintas. Gintas is in the book. It's a character in the book. I'm going to quote directly from the book because I wanted to start, instead, most podcast episodes and interviews is often like, we start talking about the interviewee immediately, but I want to talk about the listener at the beginning today because I think Gintas, listeners, Gintas is you. I think it's a lot of you. I'm gonna quote from the book. One such learner, we'll call him Gintas, told how for many years he had collected comics, instruction booklets, historical texts, any printed material that he could lay his hands on that might help him to learn, and painstakingly translated them all until he acquired an excellent knowledge of vocabulary and sentence structure. But for all that time, he had no one to interact with in the language he was trying to learn. When the opportunity finally arose, despite all his learning, he was barely able to communicate. Right? Gintas, who reads and translates and has vocab lists and all that stuff, but still couldn't really communicate in English or the language he was learning. This is probably familiar for a lot of our listeners. If you're an English learner, this might be you. If you're an English teacher, this might have been you, and it might be some of your students. And what we're going to talk about today, hopefully, what Andreas and I are going to discuss, will hopefully show you where Gintas went wrong and how to fix this kind of problem. If this is a familiar situation, if you feel like Gintas, keep listening. Hopefully we can help you. So, cool. We started with Gintas. Let's talk about you, Andreas. Who are you?
Who am I? Good question. I start my book actually with a quote from Ortega and Gasset, the Spanish philosopher. And I mention here, let me just find it for you. It reads, yo soy yo y mis circunstancias, y si no la salvo a ella, no me salvo yo. I am me and my circumstance, and if I don't save that, I don't save myself. Who am I? Good question. I'm a teacher. I'm a father. I have so many roles. So many roles that I don't even think about. I'm based in Hamburg, in Germany. I started as a teacher in Spain a long time ago. And I've been teaching for about 25 years, probably more. If I start doing the mathematics, it's probably a lot more than that. And yeah, for the last, I'm going to say the last decade, because it really was 10 years at least from when I had this idea, let's put this book together, to actually having something in my hands, being able to hold it and look stuff up in my book. So
cool. Yeah. Okay. So among all these other identities, you're also a writer, I suppose.
Yeah. True.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. Cool. And I wanted to touch on your background, because you have a really interesting background, and I'm wondering if you could share it, but also if you could sort of relate it to why you've become so interested in pragmatics. Now, it's a bit tricky to answer because a lot of people don't know what pragmatics is yet, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But yeah, in a sort of more abstract way, tell us about your background and why pragmatics interested you in relation to that.
Okay. A long time ago, when I was very little, I was living in a fishing village, lovely fishing village. It's really idyllic, on the west coast of Sweden, speaking Swedish, my first language, and just enjoying life there. And then my parents decided, okay, it's time for a change. Let's go and live in the UK. My father was an artist, so he painted lots of pictures and needed constantly, he was looking for inspiration, and he was drawn to Scotland. And then that meant that for me, I was kind of removed from this area and pushed into school in Scotland and get on with the language kind of thing. Okay?
How old were you at the time?
I was barely 6. I don't think I'd turned 6 yet.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 6 years old, you were suddenly in an English-speaking country, and you had no English.
Yeah, sure. Exactly.
Okay.
And then, yeah, I had to learn double quick because I was going to an English school, no support at that time for, for the language learner or anything like that. It was just get on with it, learn nursery rhymes or something in your own time, and then come to school and speak. And then I did that, and I copied. I tell people I speak 8 languages. I don't know what to speak a language means, but I can communicate in 8 languages.
Mm-hmm.
But with English, when I was learning English, it's now my strongest language. I was constantly using phrases that didn't really mean what I thought they meant in context. Also, people would say stuff to me in a culture that was completely new to me, and I would understand one thing, but really they meant something very different.
Okay, this is interesting because this is the core of pragmatics. So you're saying that you were saying things that you thought had a meaning, but they had a separate meaning. And also people would say things you thought it meant one thing, but it meant another thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this isn't about the vocabulary and the grammar, right? When they said something.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you think of any examples of these?
Well, I mean, the classic example is a bit of a cliche, but when somebody says, that's interesting, all right, it doesn't have to mean that. It means, yeah, actually, that's quite rubbish, or it depends on who says it and in what situation.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a good example. The phrase "that's interesting" might mean that the person thinks it's interesting, but it might mean that they think it's really terrible.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
And there's lots of examples like that.
Yeah.
And the more you explore this kind of area, as I did when I became a teacher and interested in language from the perspective of teaching it, you discover so much more, so many more examples.
Yeah. So you can understand the grammar and the syntax and the semantics of "that's interesting." You understand what it means literally, but there's sometimes hidden meanings behind the grammar, behind the syntax, and behind the vocabulary. Yeah. And we're going to walk slowly towards a definition of pragmatics, but I think already we're already building quite a clear image. But I want to draw on like a few examples from the book that were really cool examples of pragmatics. One of them's not from the book. The first one is actually from our correspondence, because pragmatics is everywhere, right? So we use it all the time. Or do we use pragmatics? That's a different question. So when we were talking about doing this podcast, like arranging this podcast on Facebook Messenger, I think it started with you. Well, we'd already talked about it like a long time before. You were busy with the book, so you didn't have time to have the interview. And then you sent me a message talking about a previous podcast that we did, the one with Chia. I can't remember which episode it was. It was about 5 or 6 episodes ago. And
I know where this is going.
Yeah. Well, you might remember. So you complimented me on the podcast episode, and and also generally on my podcast. So thanks for that. That was very nice of you. But then also, thanks a lot. Yeah, of course. And that was nice. But then obviously I realized that there's something else going on there too. I mean, I know you did like the podcast episode, but it was also a reminder, wasn't it? That you're ready to do the interview. Yeah. And give me a second. I'm going to bring up that conversation because it's a really simple example of pragmatics. You didn't ask to do the podcast interview at all, but you did ask to do the podcast interview. So you wrote, "Finally got round to listening to you and Cheer. Such a lovely chat, like listening to two friends I haven't seen for a while." And I said, it was one of my favorites. She sounded a pound. You said, "It's such a natural conversation, so the length is fine. Your interviews are much nicer than Teacher's Cafe. You're a natural. Thank you very much." And then I wrote, "Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it. Speaking of which, we're on for an interview sometime soon." You wrote, "You got the hint." So there you go. That's an example of pragmatics. In action. Another example was from the book. You talked about the life of Brian, the wall, and I think this resonates with English learners and English teachers, people who are used to the teacher-student dynamic. Remind me of that episode, that sketch, that part of the film. Life of Brian is a Monty Python film.
Hmm.
What happens?
Okay, so there's Brian, who wants to join. I can't remember. I think it's. I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's a Judean People's Front. Could be wrong. It could be the
Oh, it's
People's
the
Front
People's
of
Front of
Judea.
Judea, I think.
Is it the People's Front of Judea or the Popular Front, maybe? And his first mission is to go to the Forum Wall and to paint, like in one small corner, Romans go home.
In
Okay.
Latin.
And
In Latin.
in Latin, exactly. Yeah. And he goes and he does this, and he's caught by the centurion. And the centurion bends his ear just like you would expect in the kind of traditional school setting, and he says, "Okay, get this right, boy. Get your grammar right. It's wrong here." And
So
then he does it, and he corrects him. Go on, Gabriel. Sorry.
Yeah, just to recap it as well. Yeah, so Brian's there to write some anti-Roman graffiti. A Roman catches him, a soldier catches him, and says, "Your grammar is terrible. You got it all wrong." Okay.
And then he says, "Now write it out 100 times."
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. And then in the morning, like there's Brian who's really exhausted. And it's all over the forum, massive letters, Romani. I can't
remember. Yeah.
And Dominus or something like that. Yeah.
That's it. So yeah, this was a really good example of this centurion, this Roman soldier, was focusing so much on the grammar, he was not focusing on the meaning of the message. Romans go home. And that's where the joke is, and a good example of pragmatics and comedy. And yeah, I think this is really familiar to teachers when, something teachers and possibly learners are guilty of. It's this focus on the language so much that the pragmatics and the message is ignored at the peril of communication. It's very easy if you're a teacher and also if you're a language learner to focus on let's just call it the grammar and the vocab and not the message and the signal behind it. I've got a really embarrassing example that I had. I was in two minds to share this. I might even cut it out, but I'm gonna tell it anyway. So I had some students, and it was before the lesson. I was having a conversation, and one of my students said, "I'm really sorry I couldn't come to the lesson yesterday because, was it my mother dead, or my mother-in-law dead, or something like that." And immediately I started correcting her grammar and her vocabulary because she got it wrong, and didn't think for a second that her mother-in-law had just died, and that was not the right time to talk about the difference between death and die and dead. So I think it's a shameful example. Yeah, but I mean, do you see this a lot with learners and teachers focusing on this?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to this argument about prescribing correctness and communication.
Yeah.
Okay, it gets in the way of communication, and in the same way, pragmatics that we're going to talk about in a moment can also get in the way of communication. It can just end the conversation right there, leaving both conversational partners, wondering what happened.
Yeah. It can kill any sort of conversation if you focus too much on the grammar. Yeah. Okay, cool. I've got one more example from the book. Okay. We're still in the what is pragmatics section. So, yes, it's kind of a core example. You do a really good job of listing some different phrases. So we've got, give me a second, on page 20, if anyone's following the book. A simple phrase like "I'm tired." Now, in the book, you point out that what does that mean, right? Why does somebody say "I'm tired"? You've got three reasons. I can think of like 100 as well. You might be excusing yourself because you want to go to bed after a long day. You might be excusing yourself for not being able to concentrate or do something well because you're tired. Or it might just be that you're complaining that you don't want to listen to something anymore or do something anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a way of telling someone to stop. So this is like, it's such a simple phrase, I'm tired, but why is someone saying it? And there are 100 possible messages for that. You also talk about saying hello, saying, oh yeah, what's this? Yeah, hello. It could just mean hello as a greeting, but you could also say hello as a warning. Like there's a tone for that, isn't there? Like, hello.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's intonation is a massive clue. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with how when we speak, we can pick up on this intonation, and when we write, if we write emails, for example, or if we're in the chat or whatever, then that is quite often missed. We can use smileys and things to help us to kind of express how we're feeling, but still the intonation is gone.
Yes, yeah. The difference between hello and hello is quite different. Yeah. It's interesting you brought up smileys. Yeah, emojis are quite a good way of introducing pragmatics to digital chatting.
Sure.
Yeah. I think
definitely. I think it was David Crystal who said that it's not, emojis are not about replacing words, but it's actually a very complex form of punctuation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And language isn't just speech. Language is a lot of other things too. Expressions, intonation is part of speech, but it can also be, relationships and are part of language as well.
Sure.
Yeah. A couple more examples from this. Happy birthday. Yeah, you can say that when it's someone's birthday, but you can also say
happy birthday.
Oh yeah, happy birthday. Yeah. Yeah. What does that mean?
Sorry.
What's the signal there? No, go ahead. What's the signal there when you say it in that way?
When you say it in that way, that reminds me of, I think it was Newman and Baddiel, two British comedians.
Yeah,
they had
90s guys, weren't they?
Exactly. They were part of a group called the Merry White House Experience, and they created a character, I think his name was Ron, who spoke in a sarcastic tone of voice. And they would put him into like normal conversational or normal situations, and he just could not escape his sarcastic tone of voice, and it got him into all kinds of trouble.
That's good. Yeah. And you could use it sarcastically. Yeah. Happy birthday. Good for you. Yeah.
Exactly.
Couple more examples. Please. Okay. You can say please to invite somebody. But you can also
interesting with please as well. Sorry, Gabriel. But if we break it up, not please but please into two, what are they, diphthongs or then thank you, two syllables. Couldn't find the word. Then it just changes the whole meaning. If you break a word up from one syllable to two syllables, it can change the whole meaning of how it's interpreted and so on.
Yeah. Please. It means it means shut up, right? Like it can mean that. Yeah. Cool. And there are more, but let's move on. We got the idea of how that works. Yeah. So intonation, the way you break up a word, and just the context in how you use a word can make everything completely different and have a different message. So these examples are good, I think. And we've looked at some examples. How would you define pragmatics? We've reached that point. What is pragmatics?
People have tried. Yeah, all the best people have tried to find a different definition for it, I think.
Okay, so it's tricky. It's tricky to define.
Yeah, so basically my own definition, I think, would be, I'm really influenced by Leach, but how words take on meanings in situations and in how a word is understood depends on the situation in which it's used.
That's great. So context, I guess, is
exactly. Yeah.
I guess that's why the book is called English is context.
Exactly.
Yeah, pragmatics is about the context. Okay, great. That's cool. Nice and simple definition. We've seen lots of examples. So I think by now we're all getting a sort of clear idea about what it is and how it works. Signals is a word I like using. Like the way you say something and the context you say it in produces signals. And those signals you're probably trying to communicate without saying. Yeah. Okay, I've got a few questions. The general question. What's the difference between pragmatic awareness and simply rules for correct behavior? The difference between pragmatic awareness, being aware of how pragmatics works, and rules for correct behavior.
And general rules. True. Yeah. Okay. What is appropriate, I suppose, knowing what is appropriate for the situation. Whereas rules, you might know how to be. You just reminded me of another video sketch. Search for this if you're listening on YouTube. Have a look at John Cleese at Graham Chapman's funeral.
I haven't seen that either. John Cleese.
Right. Yeah, at Graham Chapman's funeral. He gives a speech. And the behavior is for him, or the expected behavior is for him to be there and be very solemn, respecting Graham, because Graham Chapman has passed, and speaking out of respect for the family. But really, what does he do? He just says good riddance to him, piece of rubbish, kind of thing. And he's playing with the expected behavior, but he's also, everybody knows that it's John Cleese, because it's John Cleese, it works. If I was to go to a funeral, and to start speaking like that, then it would fall pretty flat, and I would probably not be spoken to anybody again. But because it's John Cleese, he can get away with that kind of thing.
And I guess,
and that takes. Sorry, Gabriel. That takes. I think that would take a pragmatic awareness to realize that he doesn't really mean what he says. Okay, people will take him. Yeah.
Yes, and also John Cleese was obviously very, very close to Graham Chapman, whose funeral it was. So I think because they were good friends, that it means he can act the opposite way that he was expected to as well.
Sure.
In a quote unquote disrespectful way. Okay, so this is an interesting example. John Cleese has pragmatic awareness. He's aware of the context. He's aware that people know he's a comedian. He's aware that he's very good friends with the person who died. So the way he's behaving isn't showing that he's not pragmatically aware. It's clearly he's clearly pragmatically aware, but it's not rules for correct behavior, talking badly about someone when they're dead at their funeral. So great example. Yeah, you can see that in action.
Maybe if I can share another example with you as well, which is maybe a little bit similar to that. I spent maybe it took me a while, probably 2 months, researching the Suffolk dialect. I grew up in Suffolk and wrote, it looks like an academic piece, but it's really tongue-in-cheek. And I compared it to Danish.
The Suffolk dialect and the Danish language. I read this. It's on your blog.
Yeah, right? Okay. It's on my blog, exactly. Thebirdisaword.org. Just a quick plug there. But Peter Trudgill saw it.
Tell us who Peter Trudgill is.
He's a linguist and a professor of language. He's written extensively on dialect and things like that. And because it was tongue-in-cheek, he wrote back to me and he sent a comment. And Peter Trudgill, I look up to him, really respect him. And he wrote, congratulations, that's brilliant, very erudite, very ingenious, very interesting, very entertaining, very clever, very funny. And of course, almost 100% wrong. And he wrote, that's what he wrote as a comment to me. And when I saw that, I was too busy again looking up to him and respecting him to realize that he could also, in his position, he could also have a laugh with me.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's all kinds of things going on there, not just the power distance thing, maybe, but also, using humor, saying things that we mean but don't really mean. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
I guess it plays with our expectations of people too.
Mm,
When we meet a professor and we discover that they go to the gym and they're actually really funny.
sure. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's a good example. So it's a John Cleese one. Also, next question, and we're going for some direct questions, but don't worry, it'll
Okay.
get loose
Fine.
again in a minute.
All right.
Learners. Okay, so this is a big thing, and I think this is important for our listeners, whether they're teachers or language learners. That probably covers everyone, not just English learners, but general language learners. When learning a new language, a lot of people tend to take a very sort of mathematical point of view. They learn the grammar, they learn the syntax, and they learn the vocabulary, much like Gintas at the beginning of the episode. Like,
Sure.
and they look at it as something very, mathematical, I suppose, mechanical. And obviously it isn't, and this thing that Gintas has, this problem he has, is that he's thinking, okay, grammar, vocabulary, all I need to do is learn that and then I can speak English. Then he discovers he can't. And the problem there is the pragmatics. I guess that's one of his main problems. So when you're learning a language, or even if you're quite far into learning the language, or if you're a teacher trying to get your students to do their best and become as good as they can at a language, how can you introduce pragmatic competence into this process, especially from early on? Like, what kind of
okay.
what do you have any suggestions on how to do that?
We were talking earlier about the very basic phrases like hello, and how that can be misinterpreted. People, I quite often, with low level learners, I'll write the word hello on the board and I'll say, do you know this word? Yeah, of course we do. You don't really need any level of English to understand hello, I guess. But then I ask them for alternatives. What else have you heard? Oh, we've heard good afternoon. Okay, yeah, but we've heard this as well. We've heard different variations. I use hi. What is wrong with hi? Okay, people use hi in the wrong context. People will take it. I've even seen people offended by being said hi to.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then you can start like with the very basic words in the Cambridge exams, for example. Very basic Cambridge exams. The word thank you. I'll go into the speak. I have to tell all of my students this because I prepare a lot of students for Cambridge exams. And the word thank you from a speaking examiner. They're not thanking you, they're telling you to stop speaking. And I have to say, it's not a bad thing if they say thank you. It just means that you've said as much as you need to say, and then it's somebody else's turn.
Yeah.
And even at high, this goes from really low level to high level, they still don't get what this thank you is all about.
Yes. Okay, so you've got like two directions here in this answer. You've got a simple word like hello and how many other ways you can say it and what, but not just increasing your vocabulary, but when would you say this? When would you say this? When would you say this? What context is hi? Okay. What context is good afternoon? Okay. But you've also got looking at one phrase, thank you, and not the alternative to this, the word, but the alternative to what it could mean. It could mean I appreciate it. It could mean stop. It could mean
shut up.
It could mean I hate you. If someone does something terrible to you Yeah,
Right.
thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
again,
you.
intonation. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be sarcastic. So yeah, that's good. So I guess something learners can do is just basically look at a single word, very common
Mm,
word, and look at those directions they can go. Like,
sure.
yeah, yeah. I kind of
Another thing that I find really, sorry, Gabriel.
no. Go ahead, go ahead.
Another thing I find really useful for me, I'm not a fan of role play. Okay,
Hmm.
I really don't like role play. With the students that I teach people between maybe 16 and 22
Hmm.
typically, and asking them to put themselves in a situation and to be that person is just too silly for them or too,
Hmm.
they're too cool for that kind of thing. But
Hmm.
if you give them a line from a song, like choose any song that maybe can be a song that they like, and they have to put this line into context, and you don't tell them it's a song, but they have to use this line, think about how it's used, and
Hmm.
then they create the conversation around that line rather than around the situation.
Wow,
That
that's
really
really
works
cool.
for.
That's a great idea because then you can, yeah, they're forced to think about the context, not the language. Yeah, I mean
Exactly.
they're starting with the language,
Yeah.
but their work is in the context.
Yeah.
That's great. That's I'm going to use that. That's a fantastic idea.
I call it reverse role plays.
Reverse role play. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Create the context. Don't give them the context. It reminds
Yeah.
me very briefly. This is a bit of a teacher's joke. But you know what? I haven't decided whether this podcast is going to be for learners or teachers yet. So
Okay.
this will push it to the red to the teachers. But yes, the communicative language teaching approach, right? It was basically the center of English teaching for about 30 years, from the early 80s. And I remember reading something Michael Swan, Mike Swan wrote describing the communicative language teaching approach. And he just said, um, what was it? Uh, talk to your partner about radio rhubarb for 5 minutes, something like that. Oh no, you are was it you are Tony. Talk to your partner about radio rhubarb, and that was like his parody of communicative language role
Right.
play
Okay.
setup. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's true. I think a lot of teaching and a lot of this thing. You have to give your students a role play, and they have to pretend to be someone completely different, and they have to imagine how that person. I mean, acting is difficult.
Mm,
Like,
sure.
yeah,
Sure.
why
Yeah.
do we have to make our students act all the time? It's ridiculous. Yeah,
Hmm.
I like this. Make them create a context. That's all they need to do,
Hmm.
and then they can
That
figure
works
out
for them, for their situation as well, or their context.
their
Yeah.
context. Exactly. Yeah, something real
Exactly.
for them. No radio rhubarb stuff. Yeah. Okay. Here's a tricky question. Um, does the language contain the pragmatics, or is it
Hmm.
is it purely cultural and purely contextual? Where is the pragmatics? Where does the pragmatics live? Is it in the language? Is it contained within the language? Or is it something more mysterious and ethereal?
I don't think you can separate them. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost, to me, it's almost like a chicken and egg thing.
Ah,
You
cool.
know, a friend of mine said, his name's Brian Thomas. He lives in Hungary. He said, "Do the words write us, or do we write the words?"
I'm thinking about that. Give me a
Uh,
second.
yeah,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that feels like a very languagey situation.
yeah, and then you're kind of going into philosophy as well,
Yeah.
and things like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Yeah. That's just kind of screwed my brain. I'm going to be thinking about that for the rest the rest of this interview. Um, yeah. It also reminds me. I don't know if you read Ian Banks. He's a Scottish
right.
writer. He's probably my favorite writer. But yeah, there's a character in that who's like a sort of mathematical philosopher or philosophical mathematician, and she has this she has this sort of conversation she brings out at dinner parties, and it's simply, where do the numbers go?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It language feels like that. Like you
Sure.
can't separate these things. They're all one continuum. Or yeah. So okay, I guess I'll rephrase the question: is it cultural. I'm thinking of like if you've got a situation like an ELF setting, right? So you've got say a French guy, and he's talking to like an Israeli and a guy from Mozambique, I think. And they're all using English. It's not their first language. Do we see the same sort of pragmatics that we see in like Scotland? Or I mean, does the English pragmatic situation or the English cultural pragmatic situation carry with the language? Or do we just get a different cultural, like different pragmatics that are sort of separated from the British culture, shall we say, in the English language? I mean, it's kind of an easy question, but
yeah. I don't know. I guess you could, if you really dig deep in that, then what is British culture? What is the English language? It's the English language. It's spoken all over the world, and it has so many regional influences. And I guess that doesn't stop with people whose first language is English. I mean, if you mention somebody from Mozambique, for example, they're going to bring their own culture into the way they speak. We tell people all the time that students need to, or they shouldn't be afraid of losing their accent. Okay, because it shows their identity, and in the same way, so does their pragmatic competence, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, we can put people into groups of how they speak, how they communicate with each other. Like the example I gave before, like a really well respected professor speaking to little me. Who really maybe wouldn't go out for a drink together. They're not used to dealing with each other. And then, there's so many things that we can.
Yeah. And I mean, when I first wrote that question, I thought it was going to be quite easy because, when you take language to a different place and you have different people using it, their culture will be, they're going to utilize the language for their culture. And I thought that was a very clear-cut question. But then I'm starting to think, they've learned English and they're using English. And if you can't separate the language and the culture, there must be sort of dregs of like British culture or American culture still there. Like the very simple thing that, when you meet someone for the first time, you say, "How are you?" "I'm fine, thanks. How are you?" I mean, that is that's born out of a culture because, you go to the Middle East and people don't say that. They say like, "Peace be with you," and all sorts of other sort of phrases, and there's a different angle. Yeah. Sorry, I got a bit carried away.
I live in Germany, in northern Germany, as I mentioned before. And I greet my colleagues every day when I see them, and I'll speak German. To them. It's the language of the workplace is German, but I'll say the German for "How are you?" And they look at me strangely because, like, "Well, I saw you yesterday," kind of thing. "I told you yesterday how I was. Do I now need to tell you again?" And then they I don't know. I think they just keep me at a distance, whereas I'm not expecting an answer. I'm just kind of. It's a natural. Greeting for me.
Cool. So here we have an example of taking a sort of English cultural sort of pragmatic competence into a German language setting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same thing is going to happen and the same thing is going to happen into English as well. So I'm not quite sure where ELF stands with that.
This is an interesting point. So like who wins, right? Like, and I guess it's a very complex web of. Do you continue using "How are you" if you're in this sort of ELF setting, or do you try using try translating whatever you would say in your first language into English? And, Okay.
I'm not sure, Gabriel, if you gave me this idea or it may have been somebody else. It's one or two people that I know definitely gave me this idea that native speakers are recognized, native speakers, proficient speakers, people whose first language is English, are recognized as, and I've seen it several places as a BBC headline as well, I think, as being the worst communicators.
I was going to bring this up later, but yeah, go on. Yeah.
And I think it was your suggestion that why don't we write a guide, a teaching or a communication guide or something like that for people whose first language is English that need to deal with people who speak other languages.
Yeah.
So the book that I've written, I have kept that in mind from what I heard. So it's not just for people teaching learners of English, but also users of English learning to communicate with others.
Yeah, especially in an international setting.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was me. I even started like making plans for that company. It was going to be called Badger International.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't go further with it, but yeah, I even got some leads and stuff. Yeah. I think someone should do that though. I think there should be a company because I even did some research and yeah, companies are losing a lot of money because of this. There are a couple of studies.
Definite need for it.
Yeah. People can save money and make money, especially after Brexit, by being able to do that. Yeah, speaking of the cultural thing, pragmatics, and also going back to the core of pragmatics, you bring up in the book, double meanings and ambiguity. A lot of comedy is based on things being unclear or unexpected. And hey, I'm thinking from the student's point of view here, and you have stuff like, especially in, I think Britain's quite, British, the Brits are very famous for this, but I think it's across the board with like English speaking communities, that there are these in jokes, double meanings, lots of sort of irony and sarcasm, and lots of like, the language alone will not get you through communicating in these language communities. And I think also, especially these days in the last 20 years, because of the internet and because of social media, it's not just a British thing anymore or an American thing anymore. It's, you mentioned in the book, gamers, people gaming online have started evolving their own sort of language and way of communicating. And, I'm sure like there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of internet communities, and they're all developing their own languages. So if you're learning English and you need to be able to communicate, you need to be able to get over this wall, this pragmatic wall. You need to be able to understand all these signals that are not there in the vocab and not there in the grammar. As a language learner, as an English learner, whether you're trying to integrate into UK society or whether you're trying to get into online gaming or whether you're, whatever it is, you need to be able to deal with these signals. How does one do that? It's a difficult question.
As a learner, well, you mentioned comedy. Comedy is a good place to start. I've heard so often people say, I don't understand British comedy. I say, I don't watch it. They want to learn the language, but they don't watch it because they don't understand it. Maybe ways to start as a teacher or as a coach or whatever your role is in their language learning. Maybe try to find ways, which I provided, for them to deal with that and to overcome obstacles like that. Not necessarily to be able to do the same thing and to be funny, but just to understand and see why it's funny and how it works.
Yeah. So it's kind of, you've got to get your hands dirty and you've got to look at these situations. And I guess if you're like, into gaming, you'll just have to stay in the gaming community and analyze the strange language that's going on there. And cool. Comedy is really tough though. British comedy especially.
Sure.
That's hard stuff. But I think it's
And
important.
I
I
think
think
not just British either. It's any comedy in any country that you go to is going to be
yeah,
tough.
yeah, it is tough. I say maybe it's the last frontier. If you can do the comedy, you've got the language. Yeah. And I think it feels very unfair as language learning. You know, if you're what was Gintas, you know, it doesn't feel fair. You're learning the language, you're learning the words, you're learning the grammar, you're learning the vocabulary, you're learning all this stuff, and then these people play all these tricks on you when you're trying to speak to them or when you're trying to watch something on TV, and it's not fair. And I think we have to accept that it's not fair, and there's another level to learning a language.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I have now written in my notes quirk break. I've decided to introduce this thing, quirk break, probably just for this interview. But and in it, I'm going to put the quirky stuff that from the book. There's only a couple of things. Maybe I can even get a jingle going for this. I haven't got any jingles for this podcast yet. Quirk break, quirk break. So we're doing a quirk break. So the first quirk. You can call this the first quirk. So couple of just interesting points. It doesn't really merit much discussion, but during the Second World War, I love this. I didn't know about this until I read your book. During the Second World War, they wanted to be able to, you know, have the news on the radio, but they didn't want the Germans to understand the news because it could give away too many secrets. So they replaced all the BBC accented news presenters with people from Yorkshire in North England. And I can't do a Yorkshire accent. Maybe you can. You lived in Glasgow.
No, I don't think so.
I'm not going to do it any justice. But it's difficult to understand if you're not used to it. It's a very different accent from the BBC one. And yeah, that was a really cool idea to like use a local dialect as a way of I guess it was a way of like scrambling the radio. Like it was creating a code.
I was writing, I remember I was writing about, I started with rhyming slang, Cockney rhyming slang, and then it went into Australian rhyming slang, then Polari as well.
Oh yes, I wanted to talk about that too, yeah.
And then a friend of ours, Hannah Shipman, it was Hannah's suggestion. She said, "Oh, do you know about this? Do you know about the news in Yorkshire English?"
Oh, okay. So Hannah told you about this.
She drew my attention to that, and she's she's from Lincolnshire, so yeah.
She could probably do a Yorkshire accent. You bring up some good stuff like Cockney rhyming slang. This is a real go-to for advanced teachers. They love teaching this stuff.
Sure.
I'm not going to go into the details. If you're interested, look up Cockney rhyming slang. It's a weird, very creative use of English. And Polari, I found this really interesting. Polari, well, you tell me what's Polari?
What is Polari? I need to be careful here with the origin of Polari. It started as started as a slang, I think, that was used. If you look it up on the internet, in Wikipedia or somewhere like that, it's going to tell you that it was started in the criminal underworld. I'm not quite convinced that that's where it started. It was popular among actors and things like that. It's also compared to the language of Punch and Judy, which also I'm not sure about. Maybe I shouldn't mention that. But then probably in the last century, it was used as a way for people, homosexuals, to communicate with each other.
Because homosexuality was because it was illegal
was criminal
at the time.
Was criminal. and they needed to find a way, I guess, to communicate with each other, and
without anyone understanding.
Exactly, yeah. In the same way that Cockney rhyming slang started as well, and
yes,
I guess a lot of ways of speaking that we have these kind of special codes, ways of speaking.
Yeah. And they're used, this is using language and creating codes and creating new language, sort of artificially, I suppose, in order to create solidarity and to protect a group of people.
Exactly. Yeah.
Power
and
of
exclude
language.
maybe as well. Yeah. Exclude others.
Yeah, that's true. It can be used to exclude others. I guess anyone who deals with teenagers on a regular basis knows this, because teenagers are very good at this, aren't they? Like creating language that excludes non-teenagers.
Sure.
Yes. And also, finally, in this sort of quirk break category, the first quirk, I'd love to see this. I haven't YouTubed this yet. Rapping the news in Senegalese. So in Senegal.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about this. The news is rapped in Senegal.
It started in Senegal and it spread across the world pretty much in a lot of countries where people maybe don't have access to the news, or they need to be spoken to in a way that they can connect with.
So this isn't on television necessarily.
I think it is in Senegal. I think in Uganda as well, in English. In Senegal, it started as a French idea, and then it's spread.
Cool. So this is so someone would see someone rapping the news on TV, and then they would go off to somewhere where people didn't have much access to television, and they would just rap it back to the community. Wow.
To connect with them.
Yeah. And this is really interesting because, this is an ancient idea, isn't it? Because if you look at I think Beowulf, for example, very, very old English text, and it's written in rhyme, and I understand that the reason it's written in rhyme is so it's easy to remember, so people can recite it. No one could read or write, so people would just repeat it. So when it's rhyming, it's easier to remember.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool.
I think it was at IFL Brighton. I saw Arcala, if I pronounce that correctly. He is what is he? He's a poet. He trains people in theatre and things like that. And he gave, I think it was a closing plenary, and he compared Shakespeare to hip hop. And he gave everybody lines from Shakespeare and lines from hip hop. And we couldn't tell the difference.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And there's a TED talk about that as well. So you can find him. Art Taylor, his name is.
Okay. How do you spell that? I'm going to check that.
I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly. I think it's Akela.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't know about that. That sounds great. But yes, this idea of using rapping or rhyme or rhythm to make people remember stuff. So that's the first quirk over. Insert jingle here. Or maybe the news rapping in Senegalese. That's a good way to finish that.
Yo, international, désormais c'est officiel. La France légalise le mariage homosexuel. Leurs homologues sénégalais veulent l'appareil. Après l'exil politique, bientôt l'exil sexuel. Ne zappez surtout pas. Le Wolof, c'est dans un moment. La vraie info, c'est ici.
Okay, so let's talk details. I've got a few. There are some major areas in the book that are super, super, super interesting. First of all, let's talk ELF, English as a lingua franca. So non-native speaker to non-native speaker communication is basically English as a lingua franca. ELF. It's interesting. I think the most popular thing to talk about with ELF, and we've already touched on this, is that research shows that non-native to non-native speaker communication, people who have English not as their first language, talking to each other, is clearer and easier to understand than native speakers with non-native speakers, and even native speakers with native speakers. So basically, when the English guy turns up, communication starts getting lost. And even if it's an English guy with an English guy, this is the oft quoted research.
Sure.
I find this interesting. I'm going to talk about issues with that research in a second. But what role does pragmatics play in this? I got an idea on this. I think it might be because these studies are focusing on the task and the message. So when these studies are looking at sort of German guys communicating with Peruvian dudes, and they're saying, "Oh, it's much clearer," but when the English guy comes, it becomes less clear. I think these studies are only focusing on the literal meaning of things, like what is the message, what is the task. But I am imagining that there's not much pragmatics going on in these conversations. There's not so much between the lines work because people are focusing clearly on just the message. This is just my idea. I have no idea. I haven't researched it. But if this is true, if non-native speaker to non-native speaker communication is better because they're kind of ignoring all the little double meanings and ambiguity and comedy, and they're focusing on the message and they're focusing on the task, do we need pragmatics at all if they're doing a great job getting things done?
Right. I don't think we can say pragmatics is an English thing.
Okay.
It's going to happen in every language. I'm not really sure if this answers your question, but I often tell my students about the handshake.
Okay.
Yeah. Stereotypes, I don't like them, but there's a business deal going on. Okay. And there's a Frenchman in the room. Okay. Now, when Frenchmen shake hands, it's one shake of the hand. Okay. So they shake their hand once, and that's all. It's firm, but it's one shake. Okay. When the German shakes hands, it's several shakes. Okay. So the German walks into the room. The Frenchman is trying to pull his hand away.
Okay.
And the German won't let go, is still holding that hand, both of them with the same intention. Then an Englishman, stereotypically, walks into the room who is not quite so tactile. Okay, shaking hands, yes, we do it if maybe we deal with international clients, but between ourselves or between Englishmen, handshake is not really something that you do that often.
No, we just give a wave or something.
Exactly. So there's kind of one person who doesn't want to shake hands at all, another person who does, okay, I'll do it once, and the third person who won't let go.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's just before they've started speaking.
Yeah. Well, it means part of language, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. And the same thing in language as well.
Yes. In speech. Yeah. Yes. So I'm wondering if that means we should just abandon. No, we just can't get away from it, can we? I mean, there's no resolution to this handshake. Yeah. We can't abandon pragmatics. It's part of who we are. Cool. I was hoping. God.
When I was writing my book, I had an alternative title. I really wanted to give it this title, and that was the elephant in the classroom. But they said no. Let's make it clear. Okay, it's English is context. Let's work on that. It's going to be much clearer what the book is about. But I like the idiom, the elephant in the room. Okay, it's like there's an obvious truth in the room, but we don't speak about it. And I think pragmatics that's pragmatics in teaching.
That's a great title. Yeah, and that is pragmatics in teaching because it's something that is more difficult to teach, more difficult to learn, and it's something that Guntas didn't think about at all when he was learning this stuff. Also, it's using pragmatic awareness as the title as well, because you need to know what the idiom is and what it means.
Yeah. True.
It's a good title. I can see from a marketing perspective why they went with English context there. Yeah. Cool. So that's English is lingua franca. I guess we've drawn the conclusion that even in these sort of situations where there's no first language going on, pragmatics is still there. Grice. Let's talk about Grice. Now, I talked about Grice in a very early episode, in episode 8 of this podcast.
I remember. Yeah,
you listened to that one. Yeah. But do you want to very quickly, like in a nutshell, talk about Grice and talk about his maxims, because it's such an interesting part of language.
I've just got them here in front of me. There's manner, quality, quantity, and relation.
Okay, so quality is about being true or about having enough evidence. Quantity is
that you need to provide an appropriate level of information.
Not too much, not too little.
Exactly. Okay. Relation, make sure that it's relevant. Okay, and manner, don't be obscure, don't be ambiguous, avoid ambiguity.
Make it clear. Yeah. Okay.
And the best example that I can think of when I'm trying to explain Grice is you stop somebody on the street and you ask them for the way to the railway station. Okay. Now, flouting them or not agreeing with this, you could read the directions backwards.
Okay.
In reverse order. So you start at the railway station and then you make your way here.
That's flouting the maxim of, it's the last one, isn't it? That being clear.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. You could lie. You could make something up, which has happened.
Yeah.
Okay. It's
maxim of quality.
Yeah. Okay. You include too much information. So, for example, you go past this bookshop. It's a wonderful bookshop. You can get loads of stuff in there. They have English books, and then
yeah.
And what else?
Relevance. So you can show them the way to the bus station, not the train station.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Great examples. Okay, that describes it much better than I was attempting earlier. And so you have these maxims, and they basically just show you how to be they show how good communication works. And I was thinking about this, and I was also thinking about, it's 2021. We've been living in a world of fake news and propaganda, quite intense propaganda on social media and so on for quite a long time now. Since almost 10 years, I suppose, when it really started. And I was thinking about this stuff through the filter of maxims, and a couple of things. Fake news. This happens a lot. We've got fake news all over the place. And one of the most annoying things about fake news is a lot of fake news involves pointing at real news and calling that fake news. And it becomes such a muddle and so confusing very quickly. But once you start looking at it through the maxims, it becomes a lot easier to understand. You can say, it's just violating the maxim of quality. Most of the time, it's just, is that true? And it's really, and do you have enough evidence? These two things are very important. And it's just a little tick box to go, okay, is it true? Is there enough evidence? So simple, but that's the maxim of quality. Does it pass the maxim of quality? It's just an observation. I think it's a really good way of looking at things. And I think it's good that you brought up Grice in the book because of that.
Oh, sure. I can't write about pragmatics and not mention Grice. I mean, everything kind of started where it started goes back to speech acts with Austin and things like that. But Grice kind of first proposed what he called the cooperative principle. And ever since then, this was in the late 60s, I think, ever since then, people have just argued and found alternatives to argue with Grice, but there's nothing really been found to match it.
Yeah, it's very simple. That's the key of it. And I was thinking, I've been reading a lot recently. This writer, I can't remember his name, so I'm not going to do it justice. He wrote a very good book. I think it's called "Nothing is True and Anything is Possible," and it's about sort of 21st century Russia and how truth is completely sort of ambiguous in the political and in the media landscape. And I was thinking about propaganda in the good old days and propaganda now. And they're vastly different. So if we go back like behind the Iron Curtain, if we go back to 1960s USSR or whatever, and the way propaganda would work back then, I'm not saying it was just then, by the way. I don't want to make it a bit more balanced, but I'm going for them because it's an easy target, USSR, Soviet stuff. And the way that the propaganda worked there was that you would not give information. You would withhold information. You wouldn't tell people about what was happening in certain places. There would be lies as well, but one of the most powerful things was not to let people see things and not to let people know about things. So here we have a clear, breaking the maxim of quantity, right? Not providing enough information. But then the wall fell and the Soviet stuff is all over now. But we still have lots of propaganda around the world and all over the world now. And with the internet and the freedom of information, you can't do that anymore. You can't withhold information. It's all there. So what do? You go the opposite way. You still break the maxim of quantity, but instead of withholding and not providing enough, you overload it. You provide too much. And this is how propaganda works now. When you go online and you see all this stuff, you'll have a speech by a politician. I'm thinking of a few in particular. I'm not going to say their names. And they will contradict themselves 7 times in this one speech. And it doesn't matter because they're providing so much information that it becomes effective propaganda. Sorry, I was a bit of a rant.
I can think of one politician who said that we'd all misunderstood. We hadn't understood that it was a joke.
Yes, it was just a joke. Yeah. So I think especially in this very difficult time, Grice is really valuable because you can really understand what's going on and it becomes much less distressing. Yeah. Digital literacy should incorporate Grice.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Sorry,
it's interesting you say that. There's an illustration. Let me just check that for you. There's an illustration of the different levels of linguistic competence. And it starts with phonetics and then it moves up. It's like a ladder. It's
like a hierarchy.
Exactly. Into phonology, morphology, like looking at the words and things, and syntax. So you're putting the words and phrases into sentences. Semantics, and then right at the top is pragmatics and understanding meaning in context. And the people who put this together, it's been shared. If you look up pragmatics, Google Images, you're going to find, I think it's like a bullseye, I think, and that the outer ring is pragmatics, like the highest level or whatever. But that's been put together by some people who were computer or IT people, not linguists. Yeah.
That's interesting.
So that ties in,
because that assumes that the target is phonology. The target of learning a language is phonology. If only it was that easy. Yeah. Yeah. No, a hierarchy is not how it works. That's so true. It's all meshed together. It's spaghetti bolognese. Yeah. That's Grice. Let's talk about Leech.
Okay, future me here. Just a little quick interjection because I realised that Andreas and I did that terrible thing when we both assumed that everyone understood who Leech was and what he talked about. So we didn't really explain it. So here we are, very quickly. I'm just going to read directly from Andreas's book. Where Grice was interested in how things can be said indirectly, Leech was concerned with the impressions that our utterances have upon the hearers. This has become generally known as linguistic politeness and should not be confused with courtesy. Leech's politeness maxims were: Tact, speaking in terms of benefit to the hearer. For example, Leach compared the phrase "peel these potatoes" with "do have another sandwich." While both sentences are orders, the second is much friendlier or more polite, as it offers a positive reward for doing whatever it is, making it difficult for the hearer to refuse. Generosity, minimizing the benefit to the speaker. For example, comparing "you must come and have dinner with us" and "we must come and have dinner with you." And "could I borrow your car" seems kinder and less presumptuous than "could you lend me your car?" Approbation, praising the hearer instead of the speaker. For example, "how clever of you," and not "how clever of me." Modesty, minimizing the praise of the speaker. For example, "how stupid of me" is much more clement than "how stupid of you," which can be seen as a personal attack. Agreement, seeking to avoid disagreement between the speakers. For example, saying "that's interesting" instead of voicing your disapproval. "I hear what you say" respects the hearer's opinion, even though everyone knows there is a "but" coming. And finally, sympathy, expressing feeling and understanding with the hearer. For example, "I'm so sorry to hear that your team lost the game" will endear the speaker to the hearer much more than "I'm so pleased to hear that your team lost the game." While the non-preferred sentences above may seem unlikely, they are often adopted in a playful way, or by those who purposely attempt to inflame or attack group members. In gaming forums and social media platforms, people who do this are known as trolls. Great. I hope that gives you a better idea about what we're about to start talking about. On with the podcast.
So Leach.
Okay.
Who was Leach? What did he do?
Okay, Leach was around at about the same time as Grice. He wrote a book called The Principles of Pragmatics, and he started to introduce us to politeness, and he added to Grice's maxims. Leach is really my top guy. I went to a summer school in Lancaster some years ago where to celebrate 30 years of Principles of Pragmatics, and Leach was there.
Cool.
And it was really, pretty exciting.
Fantastic. Did you meet him?
I did, okay. And I spoke to him, and very good memories of that time.
Cool. Did you plug the book?
Sorry?
Did you plug the book while you were there?
No, the book was still in my mind at that time.
Okay.
I think it wasn't. Sure. But he introduced further maxims that kind of dealt with politeness. So he spoke about tact and generosity, approbation, modesty, sympathy, things like this. Yeah.
Okay. I think this is a more familiar area, especially to people learning a language, because it's basically about different ways of being polite and respectful to your listener, right?
Sure.
And we even get that stuff in course books. I think it's easier to teach that stuff because I think it's very bound with language. Polite language is quite teachable, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that a big difference between Grice and Leach, from a sort of international point of view, I suppose, Leach's maxims feel quite culturally specific because politeness changes a lot across cultures. Whereas with Grice, it's more about, the nature of what you're trying to say, the nature of your message. But with Leach, it's kind of very much about more of an interactive thing, isn't it? It's about how to be nice to people.
Sure.
But you have.
Although,
go on.
Sorry. I think it's maybe worth pointing out that they were not trying to tell us how to speak. They were just observing what happens with the language. They were not teachers. They were linguists. So they were just watching what was going on with the language and writing about that.
This was it the 70s when this was going on?
Yeah.
So I'm presuming, because the nature of linguistic research at the time was probably in quite a monocultural. The people they were observing might all have just been people from London, or it was much less diverse because it was a less international environment. The world was less international. That's a contradiction in terms, but less diverse, I suppose. And I'm wondering if because you have classic examples, right? You have like being indirect in British culture is very very polite, but if you're indirect in Russia, it's considered evasive and rude.
Right.
So yeah, these have to. I guess the maxims are valuable, but they feel a little bit too grounded in particular culture, I think. I'm just wondering how they can be like how they can be transferred, like whether you could look at them and see your own culture or your own sort of language community and see how they could work and how they could be altered.
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that's manageable?
I mean, yeah, these were kind of the initial stages of this kind of thinking, this kind of observation, and then after Leach came Brown and Levinson, who started. And my book is kind of structured based on Brown and Levinson.
Okay.
Who started speaking. They observed several languages, what goes on in different languages, and they spoke about things like negative politeness, positive politeness, being very direct, being off record, this kind of thing.
And face, I like this idea, the saving face, because it was Brown and Levinson that talked about face. So by face we mean
face-saving strategies.
Face-saving strategies. How not to be embarrassed, because we all get embarrassed when we're talking all the time.
Right.
We hide it, but we do. And we're all worried about looking like a fool. So when we're already, let's bring this to the language learner again. When we're thinking about the language and which words to use and which grammar and tense to use, how can we sort of avoid looking like a fool? How can we avoid being embarrassed by the social side of things? Is there an easy answer to that? And do Brown and Levinson provide a clue or a framework for that?
As regards to framework, I think there's a framework that you can work with, and that's what I tried to do. There's a lot of talk in teaching now about intercultural competence, and things like that. And I've seen like quizzes and things produced for these kind of classes where, what do you know about this country? And it's a lot of it is fact and food and the flag or something like that. And I think this just takes it to a very different level to how we actually communicate.
I like that. Yeah, and I think the Leach can help with that as well. So using what they've observed as a way of learning about a different culture.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's cool. So
okay, and also we can't say that this culture is indirect. This culture is direct. But there are, like with English, for example, there's a lot of phrases that you won't have in other languages, like you said about indirectness. There's a lot more. There seems to be a lot more in English ways of, all this flowery language that,
would you terribly
to the Germans, for example, exactly, it seems insincere. What we're trying to do in English, by speaking English, we're trying to protect ourselves, save our face. But in another language, it's seen, or to another people from another country, it's seen as lying, as being insincere, trying to con you in some way.
Yes, and actually that brings me to an interesting point, because Grice talks about, give me a second, I've got a note here. Grice sort of works from a point of view of being cooperative, right? And communication flowing and people being able to understand each other well. I get the feeling with Leach and his politeness principles that it's, he talks about goals, which is interesting. Pragmatics is about implication. in my view, it feels more like it's about implication. So introducing this idea of goal was quite interesting. And then I started thinking, okay, Leach is kind of showing us how we can get what we want and how we can sort of manipulate people and sweet talk people. And you have this politeness principle, which seems very nice, but then it started feeling quite sinister to me. And it was like, okay, Leach is showing us how to carry out our hidden agenda. I'm being extreme for the sake of the fact, but and it reminded me. Have you seen the film Funny Games?
No.
Danish film, I think, actually.
Okay. Right.
Very old. And in short, it's a horrible film. It's terrifying. There's a lovely family, like parents and a young child and a dog, and they've gone on this sort of summer holiday, like chalet, like a nice house that they're renting. And then these two polite, dressed in white, lovely, clean men who live next door, like come, and they're really polite and super polite and formal and lovely. But they're not lovely because over the course of the film, they're just being polite and basically manipulating the other people to do things through being polite, because you can't refuse a polite request. And so it ends up in a terrible way. I mean, the family is completely held hostage. There's no threat of violence. There's no guns. There's nothing like that. Through sheer politeness, they terrorize this family. It's a sort of sick sort of pleasure.
Okay. Right.
Dark film, but they're totally exploit. Yeah, it's a very good film. It got remade, American one. I don't know if the American one's any good, but I guess the Danish one will do. It's very good. And it's really interesting. The whole film is based on pragmatics. The whole film is based, I think, a little bit on using Leach's maxims, because they're just following his maxims. I guess they're more specific to Danish politeness, but I thought it was an interesting premise. And I felt with Leach, it felt a bit Funny Games at its worst.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. I'm a skeptic.
Reminds me. I before COVID started, before we had to sit still in our respective countries, I used to travel a lot. I used to present a lot. And I remember I went to, I think it was to Sweden, and I spoke to a group of teachers there about teaching English. And they said, one person came up to me and said, tell me, England, football hooligans, that's what they're famous for. Road rage, How come that there's all this aggression and at the same time there's so much politeness? Like polite phrases, ways of saying things, avoiding saying things directly. And I went away and I thought about that for a long time. And I think it was, I could be wrong again, I think it was Hugh Deller that I spoke to, and I said, Hugh, what do you think? This is really bugging me, this question. And I think it was Hugh. He said, we have these strategies to protect ourselves from ourselves.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's a very huge thing to say. But so we use the politeness because we're bubbling with rage underneath, and we need to shine
that. Just a phrase like, for example, let me see. Would you mind if I opened a window? Or for example, you can say no if you want to, or I don't suppose I could borrow your car.
Okay.
If you say no, that's fine, because I've already said I don't suppose. Yeah. If you say yes, I wouldn't mind. It's you that's losing the face. I've already protected myself.
Yes, it reminds me of the nervous teenager who's trying to ask somebody on a date. I know you don't want to, but do you want to? And prefacing, I know you don't want to. I know you're going to say no. But, You're probably
Sure,
the third one too. Yeah, I think there's some sense in that. So it's face-saving technique, being polite.
Yeah, I mean that's to an extreme. Of course, we're not all like that.
No,
but
this is also
kind of going in the
somewhat of a
know what I'm trying to
stereotype.
say.
Yeah, I mean, I personally believe that everyone around the world is boiling with rage underneath. So, no, just cool. Yeah, I think I've covered basically everything, or we've covered everything. I wanted to finish with the takeaway bit. So the book is divided into 3 parts, right? You got
it's part of the Delta teacher training, teacher development series.
Yeah.
And so it follows a pattern of all of these books, which is A, B, and C.
Yes. And is it B or C? I can't remember. That has basically it's a whole chapter of exercises that you can use in your classroom immediately.
It's B.
Right? That's B. Okay.
Yeah. And what I've done in my book is there's also a section of very short activities. Like if you are stuck for something to do, you need something quickly, you can just pull on that and use it with 0 prep.
That's good, because I wanted to ask for 3 exercises for learners. Now, I know that a lot of the advice in the book is has sort of case studies, role plays, guided discoveries, and things that work really well with the sort of teacher-student dynamic. And they're really good exercises, like, by the way, really, really cool, really creative. Love them. I'm just wondering, students who are self-studying, because I think a lot of our listeners are kind of self-learners, and they're not really going to classes so much. And what advice, what 3 takeaway exercises, if you can pull any off the top of your head, that learners can just do by themselves in order to improve their pragmatic awareness?
This really is from the top of my head.
Okay, I'm challenging
because I think one thing that I find really useful is an app called Radio Garden or My Tuner, which allows you to tune into any radio station around the world.
I've seen this. It's amazing. Yeah.
And it works basically like Google. What was it called? It wasn't Maps, but I haven't used it for a long time now. Google Globe. You kind of get the globe.
Oh, that was an older
thing. And then
thing,
you can zoom. I think so.
Google Earth, I think it was called.
Google Earth. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you need to, or you have like the globe, and you can spin it around, and you can do things, zoom in on areas and whatever. And every green dot that you have is not only a city, but it's all radio stations. And you can just play with that for ages. I mean, I'm from the generation where I would sit with a shortwave radio and see what I could tune in as a kid. So that really appeals to me. And I think it's a good thing for learners as well, if they want to understand how people converse in Canada, for example. They can go to Canada, they can pick up on conversation and then try to pick up on what they're talking about.
That's great. So you go from like Texas to Canada to Philippines to Singapore to South Africa, middle of Australia. Yeah, that's great. So you can pick up on not just accents and dialects, but also just the humor and the way people kind of talk.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Okay, good one. First one's great. Radio Garden.
Yeah.
Which is funny.
On My Tuner as well. It's on my TV as well. If you have like a TV with apps, then you can watch. You can download it, or it's probably already installed.
That's great. Also, I like the name Radio Garden because it's one half of one 90s band and another half of another 90s band.
Right. Yeah.
Radiohead
True.
Sound Garden. Yeah. Radio Garden, the ultimate 90s band. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Can you pluck 2 more tips?
I'm going to take one as well, which is not from my book, but it really is a lifesaver at this time when people are having to teach from home, and they don't see their classes, and maybe you want to do some work on some working with words in context. And this is an app. I don't have the link for you, but maybe we can find that later and you can share that. It's called Code Words.
Code Words. Yeah. Code Words.
And you can play with people you don't know, or you can play with people in your class. You can set it up, and basically you get a grid of words. And one person is then elected to try and get the others to say as many of the words that this person is given that the others don't see, based on a context.
Based on the context. That's the key of this.
And it's your understanding of the context.
Oh, great.
Okay,
so could you give an example of how that might flow?
So you could have, for example, pineapple, could be a word. You could have, what's another one? Maybe ivy.
Okay,
and maybe, I'm just looking at things around me right now. You could have forest.
Okay, so these are totally...
forest is a good one. That came up in my lesson the other day, the word forest.
Okay.
And the student wrote male. Okay, this was a clue to the words that you had to guess. And nobody got the word male, or nobody could. M-A-L-E.
Okay, so female, male. Okay. All right.
And forest was one of the words that we could guess. Okay. And I thought, Forrest, that's male. Forrest Whitaker, Forrest Gump. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's how it works. You need to try and make connections with.
It's a lateral thinking.
Exactly.
Okay. That's great, because you really get into someone's head. Cool. Yeah, great one. So code words. Yeah, play with other English speakers and get inside their heads.
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. And have you got a third tip?
What can I come up with? What can I give you?
Everyone always does 3. Maybe 2 is a good number.
Another one that you might want to think about is like there was a competition. I think it was a Emoji Spelling Bee.
Ooh, an Emoji Spelling Bee. Okay, how does that work?
So there's a guy who was appointed the world's first emoji translator by a marketing firm in London. And as part of his interview, there were lots of applicants, and they had an emoji spelling bee, and they had to try to write sentences. I think he ended up writing the Old Testament or something in emoji. So that's something that you could play around with as well, taking sentences and then getting characters to. So you're replacing. Doesn't have to be the Old Testament, but
it wouldn't be my first choice. Yeah, that's great. So you could think of a sentence, and then you could instead of you have to write the sentence just using emojis. That's good. Yeah, that would uncover a lot of sort of cultural and relationships between things like forest and male. Yeah.
Sure.
Great.
I've done this in my class. I've given my class an emoji spelling test or emoji. Like I give them a phrase with my class. I'll give them the phrase, and then I'll get them to draw the emoji that relates to that. And the best one, my favorite one, is the pile of poo emoji.
The poo emoji. Yeah.
Exactly. Now in Europe, it's basically meant used, I think, to symbolize crap. Something is like rubbish,
negative. Yeah.
But in Japan, where it I think originated from, it means good luck.
Poo means good luck in Japan.
Because the Japanese word for poo is very similar to luck.
Oh, so it's a semantic thing.
Yeah,
that's so cool. Also, I was thinking that happens, if a pigeon poos on you, or a bird pees on you, it's considered good luck. Yeah. Great. Okay, so this is good because then you get a good way to uncover cultural references. Yeah, sure. Emoji. Great. I'm going to recap that. So radio garden for the radio, code words for getting inside an English speaker's mind, and an emoji spelling bee. Great.
And these are just off the top of my head. I mean, there's I think 80 activities or 80 ideas in the book. Right?
Yeah, so. The book has a whole section on, is it over 80? Wow, that's great. Yeah, for teachers and learners alike. So yeah.
And I tell people as well, it's not just a teaching book because there's lots, like you've pointed out before, there's lots of anecdotes and things like that, bits about the language. So even if you're not a teacher, but you're just interested in language. And
that's what I find really cool about books like this, because things, everything's connected. If you're just someone who's interested in language, you should still be reading books like this, even if they're primarily directed towards teachers.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable thing. And also, if you're a learner, it's good to know. I think that the world of learners and the world of teachers should be much more intertwined.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you're learning a language, see how the teachers think. And also, it's good for teachers to understand what it's like for the learners. Yeah,
and also see what the linguists are doing, what they're observing about the language as well, what's going on with the language, how's it changing, all this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's where the really interesting stuff is. Yeah. Fantastic. And we covered a lot of that today. Before we finish, do you want to plug your pluggables?
The book is English with Context, and then with a subheading Practical Pragmatics for Clear Communication. So it's not just about pragmatics, but it introduces pragmatics. It's not, I've tried not to make it a kind of heavy academic book, which I don't think it is. The intention is basically for it to entertain people with the language and to have fun with the language. I've tried to carry that on with my blog, which is the bird is a word or one word.org. And I also present quite a bit still, even though I said 2 years ago, webinars are not for me. I'm not going to go online. I'm not going to teach online. That's all changed. I've now got workshops coming up. I've got one at the IO TEFL conference coming up very soon.
What's it on?
English is Context.
Of course.
So it's a promotional thing for the book. I'll be sharing activities from the book and sharing a few thoughts there.
Cool.
And
great. Yeah. So lots of places to be found online.
Sure.
Yeah. Sure. Great. Well, Andreas, do you have any questions, or do you want to add anything final? Add anything final? That sounds a bit ominous. Is there anything you'd like to add before we finish?
I don't think so. Just please feel free to get in touch with me. Anyone that does get the book, that does read or listen to our conversation today, I'd love to hear what you think, even if you maybe don't agree with me. I'm not asking you to. Just let me know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think especially, I always like getting emails from people that disagree with what I'm saying. I find it much more entertaining, and it's good to get the conversation going.
Definitely.
Cool. Yeah. All right, in that case, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Andreas. That was golden.
Gabriel, thank you so much. Absolute pleasure.
Wicked, and I hope to run into you online, or preferably offline at a conference somewhere.
Oh, that would be really cool. Yeah.
Wicked. Cool, take care. Thanks a lot.
Okay, you too. Thank you.